How Vikings survived the frozen seas. From Scandinavia to North America. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a colder world. One of gray skies, creaking ships, and long horizons where ice and ocean blur together. So, if you're settled in, lights dim, blanket wrapped up, maybe a warm drink nearby. Let's sail north, slowly and quietly, into the world of the Vikings. Not the loud, axe-swinging kind that television likes so much. No glowing armor, no battle music. Just the real ones, exhausted, practical, slightly damp men trying not to freeze to death somewhere between Norway and Newfoundland. Because the North Atlantic, even in the best of weather, was not exactly user-friendly. It was vast, cold, and deeply uninterested in human survival. Yet somehow, the Vikings crossed it. Repeatedly. In open wooden ships. Without maps. Without fire. So, tonight, we're going to drift through that question. How exactly did they manage it? How did they sail thousands of miles through some of the harshest waters on Earth? And live to tell sagas about it? Let's start where they did. On the edge of the known world. The Viking world. A cold beginning picture. The fjords of Norway. Narrow valleys carved by ice, walls of rock and pine, water dark as iron. The air is sharp enough to make your teeth ache. That's home. The Vikings, though they didn't call themselves that, lived in a world where nature wasn't scenery. It was a full-time opponent. The soil was stingy, the winters endless, and even summer had a bad attitude. You didn't conquer this world. You bargained with it. The sea was their escape, their workplace, and their road system all in one. If you wanted more than what your local fjord could offer, you went to sea. Not because you were brave, bravery was optional, but because staying put meant starvation. And so they built ships that could outsmart the water. The longship. A miracle of wood and nerves now, it's easy to look at a Viking longship in a museum and admire how sleek it is. All those curved planks and elegant carvings. But let's be honest, it's also terrifying. A longship was long and narrow, open to the air, and low enough that a good wave could wash straight over the side. There was no deck, no cabin, no storage below. Just 30 to 60 men, a few chests, some sheep, and a whole lot of ocean. The planks were overlapped, a method called clinker build. So the ship flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. It was the difference between surviving a storm and becoming fish food. Each plank was fastened with iron rivets and sealed with wool, soaked in tar, which, by the way, smelled as bad as it sounds. The result was a hull that was light, fast, and surprisingly sturdy. But here's the catch. The Vikings didn't bring fire on board. Not in open seas. A single stray ember could turn the whole ship into kindling. So there was no warm food, no heat, no light at night. Just cold salted air, and whatever you could chew without cooking. It was survival by sheer stubbornness. The art of staying alive on a floating freezer. You might think the Vikings dressed for the weather. Thick furs, wool cloaks, that sort of thing. And they did. But even the best wool can't outmatch the North Atlantic in February. They layered wool, linen and sheepskin, sealed with oil and sweat, and still ended up soaked to the bone. Sleeping was nearly impossible. They curled up under animal hides or sat upright, taking turns rowing and bailing out water. For warmth, they relied on friction, not the romantic kind, but the constant physical grind of rowing, hauling, adjusting sails, and swearing at the wind. Movement kept you alive. Stopping was dangerous. Food was equally practical. Dried fish, salted meat, hard bread, and butter so thick with salt it could probably repel demons. Fresh water was stored in barrels, often tasting faintly of wood and despair. But this diet worked. High in calories, low in joy. The crew's survival depended not on comfort, but on routine. Every man knew his task. One steered, others adjusted ropes. Some kept watch for ice or land, and through it all, days, sometimes weeks, the only sound was the creak of wood, the slap of waves, and the occasional grunt of regret. Navigating by nothing now. Here's where things get strange. How do you cross an ocean without a compass, map, or GPS? The Vikings didn't have any of those. What they did have was experience, and eyes sharp enough to notice everything. They studied the flight of birds, the color of the water, the shape of clouds. They knew when driftwood appeared. Land wasn't far, and when whales showed up, it meant deep water. Time to steer carefully. Sunstones, crystals like Iceland spar, might have helped them locate the sun even through clouds. It's debated, but it's plausible. And of course, they watched the stars. The North Star, always steady, always there. They didn't sail blindly. They sailed by pattern. They followed known sea routes, from Norway to the Faroes, to Iceland, to Greenland, and then, eventually, to North America. Each leg of the journey was short enough to survive, long enough to matter. It wasn't luck. It was logistics, primitive, but precise. The first hop, from Norway to Iceland, wasn't exactly a vacation spot, but it was land. Solid, volcanic, sheep-filled land. The first settlers arrived around 870 CE, and what they found was both bleak and beautiful. There were no trees to speak of, no real soil, and the wind had personality. But there was fresh water, good grazing, and, most importantly, safety from rival chieftains back in Norway. The voyage from Norway took about a week, sometimes longer if the weather was feeling dramatic. Ships sailed close together when they could, using shouts and horns to stay in contact. And when they finally saw land, the relief must have been indescribable. Not because they'd discovered a new world, but because they could finally stand still without freezing. Iceland to Greenland. The icy gamble. If Iceland was a cold paradise, Greenland was a dare. According to the sagas, it was settled by Eric the Red, who, after a few murders too many, decided exile was as good a reason as any to go exploring. He called it Greenland to make it sound more appealing. Marketing genius. That one. The voyage to Greenland was brutal. Fog, icebergs, storms. Everything you don't want when you're in an open wooden boat. And yet, by 985 CE, people made it. They built farms, churches, and even exported walrus ivory. For a few centuries, Greenland was a small outpost of Norse life. Sheep, turf houses, and all, but it wasn't sustainable. As the climate cooled, crops failed, and trade faltered, the colony slowly disappeared. No one knows exactly how. Whether they starved, left, or were absorbed by local Inuit populations, but by the 1400s, they were gone. Still, for a people who started in the fjords of Norway, they'd made it unimaginably far. Greenland to Vinland, the edge of the map, and then, of course, came North America. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, supposedly set sail around the year 1000 and found land to the west. He called it Vinland, the land of wine, probably because of the wild grapes or possibly because he was just optimistic. We now know they reached Newfoundland, Canada. At a site called L'Anse aux Meadows, archaeologists found the remains of Norse houses, clear evidence that they'd crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus. They built, repaired, explored, and then left. Why? Likely because it was too far, too isolated, and the locals, indigenous peoples they called, Skraelings, were understandably not thrilled about unexpected visitors. The Norse preferred places they could quietly farm without being speared. So they retreated to Greenland, leaving behind one of history's most quietly impressive achievements: the first transatlantic crossing by Europeans. Life at sea, the quiet between storms. For all the violence in Viking stories, real voyages were mostly quiet. Days of gray skies, endless rowing, and the dull ache of muscles that never stopped hurting. They told stories to pass time. Sagas of gods, heroes, and occasionally people much luckier than they were. They repaired sails with frozen fingers, bailed water with wooden buckets, and prayed that the next wave wasn't the last. When storms hit, they lashed everything down and waited. No fighting it, no heroics, just endurance. And when the skies cleared, they'd look for birds again, for driftwood, for signs of hope. There's a kind of poetry in that. A people known for raiding and fire, surviving instead through patience and cold endurance. The return homecoming home was the hardest part. Ships often returned damaged, sails torn, crews reduced. But when they did return, bringing news, stories, and the occasional exotic trinket, they became legends. Not for conquest, but for survival. Because to cross the frozen North Atlantic without fire, without comfort, and without certainty, that's not adventure. That's endurance disguised as bravery. So as you lie there now, warm and dry, maybe listen for the faint sound of waves, because somewhere out there, in the dark Atlantic, the ghosts of their ships still drift. Wooden hulls creaking softly under endless sky. And that's how the Vikings conquered the cold. Not with violence or gods, but with stubbornness, teamwork, and a remarkable tolerance for damp socks. What did executioners do when there were no executions? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when jobs were a little more specific, and few people were more clearly defined or more avoided than the local executioner. You might imagine them as hooded figures, standing beside wooden scaffolds, grim and silent, ready to end the life of whoever had upset the wrong noble that week. And yes, That was part of the job. But the truth is, they didn't actually do that very often. In most medieval towns, there were only a few executions a year, sometimes fewer. Which raises a surprisingly practical question. What exactly did executioners do when there were no executions? Tonight, we'll drift gently through the lives of the men, and occasionally, women, who found themselves permanently linked to death. We'll explore how they lived, how they earned a living when nobody was being beheaded, and how a person became an executioner in the first place. Because, as you'll soon see, no one ever wanted to be one. Let's start somewhere quiet. Imagine a medieval town. Stone walls, muddy streets, a faint smell of horses and unwashed optimism. The market square is the social center, full of vendors shouting prices and children chasing stray chickens. And at the far edge of that square, a little apart from the bustle, stands a small, crooked house. That's the executioner's home. He lives there with his family, if he's lucky enough to have one, and with a sense of being permanently on the outside. You see, executioners were legally necessary, but socially despised. People needed them to do their job, but they didn't want to touch them, or talk to them, or live near them. Medieval society had a very enthusiastic approach to social boundaries. The church warned that touching an executioner could make you spiritually unclean. In some towns, they weren't allowed to enter taverns or touch food in public markets. In others, they could only walk down certain streets, the idea being that everyone else could simply avoid them. So, yes, necessary, but untouchable, which is not a great combination for your social life. But back to our main question. If they weren't chopping off heads every day, and most weren't, how did they earn money? The first thing to understand is that executioners were, in many cases, civil servants. They were technically on the town payroll, which meant they received a small salary to be available whenever needed. But it wasn't much, so to make ends meet, they had to get creative. And by creative, I mean very grimly practical. Because when you think about it, executioners had a rare skill set. They knew anatomy. They'd seen inside people, sometimes literally. They knew how to make incisions, how to use blades, how to stop bleeding. They were also immune to squeamishness, which is a very employable quality in certain medieval side hustles. So many of them became, unofficially, the town's doctors. Yes, when you got an abscess, or a bad tooth, or a boil the size of a walnut, you might find yourself knocking, somewhat nervously, on the executioner's door. In many records, executioners are noted as healers or surgeons. The same man who had once executed a criminal in the square might, the next morning, be setting a broken bone or stitching up a drunk who'd fallen off his cart. It's a strange duality, isn't it? The man everyone avoided was also the one most likely to save your life. This crossover between executioner and healer wasn't just an odd coincidence. It was practical. Medical schools were rare, and actual physicians mostly treated the rich. But the executioner's experience with wounds and death meant he often had a better understanding of the human body than anyone else in town. So, yes, he was the man who could kill cleanly, but also the man who could cut cleanly. And that's not all. Executioners were also responsible for torture, the grim bureaucracy of medieval justice. When the court ordered someone questioned with severity, that meant the executioner was called in to handle the tools. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't pleasant, but it was part of the job. When there were no executions, there were interrogations. And when there were no interrogations, there were body disposals, because, of course, once someone was executed, the work wasn't over. You might think the sentence ended with death. It did not. Medieval authorities were very big on making examples. Corpses were hung from gibbets, displayed at crossroads, or left dangling in cages as moral instruction to anyone passing by. Someone had to handle that. And naturally, it wasn't going to be the mayor. So the executioner managed the body after death, cleaning, quartering, and sometimes boiling the remains to preserve them. Boiled heads, for example, were less likely to fall apart while being displayed on a spike, which was, apparently, an important detail of civic decorum. Executioners even dealt with the bodies of criminals after hanging, preparing them for medical study or burial in unconsecrated ground. Some even managed the cemeteries for the poor, because, as we'll see, their association with death made them the unofficial custodians of society's unwanted. So, in short, when there were no executions, executioners worked as surgeons, undertakers, corpse handlers, and, occasionally, local sanitation managers. Truly, a portfolio career. But how did someone become an executioner? That's where things get darker, and a little more ironic. Because most people didn't choose this life. It was forced on them. If you were convicted of a crime that carried the death penalty, there was one way to save your neck. Agree to take the job of executioner. It was a sort of medieval plea bargain. The authorities needed someone to do the work. And, unsurprisingly, there weren't many volunteers. So condemned men were offered a grim deal. You could die, or you could become the man who does the dying for others. And many took the offer. Some of the most famous executioners in Europe started this way. Criminals turned civil servants, marked by permanent disgrace. Their children inherited both the job and the stigma, which meant entire dynasties of executioners appeared, generation after generation, like grim family businesses. There were executioner families in France, Germany, and Switzerland that held the office for centuries. They intermarried with each other because no one else would have them. Their children played only with other executioners' children, and in some records, they even formed their own communities. Tiny, isolated social worlds of the unwanted. It's a sad thought. Really, generation after generation, condemned not by crime, but by association. Let's drift over now to one of the most famous of these families, the Sanson of France. The Sanson family served as royal executioners in Paris for nearly 150 years. They oversaw everything from the era of Louis XIV to the French Revolution. 7 generations of them, passing down the same grim tools and public shame. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most famous of them, executed Louis XVI himself, a man born into a job he never wanted, ending the life of a king who had likely never spoken to him before. And after that, after the revolution, he retired quietly, a relic of a violent age, replaced by the very machine that had made his work efficient. The guillotine. There's something eerily poetic about it. The executioner executed by progress. But before we drift too far into the 18th century, let's step back into the medieval world again. The world of local, small-town executioners whose lives were far less dramatic and far more tedious. Imagine being one of them in a town where there hadn't been a major crime in years. Your job title still said executioner, but the last person you'd executed was probably a chicken thief in 1412. So, what did you do? Well, some supplemented their income with knacker work, dealing with dead animals. They'd clear carcasses from the streets, skin them for leather, or boil down the remains for tallow. It was unpleasant, but again, nobody else wanted to do it. And this association with filth and death just deepened their isolation. They lived on the edge of town, literally and socially. Their homes were often beside the gallows or the gibbet hill, a constant reminder of their work. Children were told not to go near them. If you touched an executioner, you might have to bathe in holy water, just to be safe. There's even a story from 16th century Germany about a man who accidentally brushed against an executioner at a festival, panicked, and immediately paid for a priest to bless him. The executioner reportedly just shrugged. It wasn't new. And yet, despite all this, some executioners became strangely respected, because the same social distance that made them untouchable also made them impartial. They were above or below the petty rivalries of townsfolk. When disputes arose, people sometimes turned to them as neutral mediators, and their medical work, however grim, saved lives. There are surviving letters where patients thank their local executioner for curing wounds that no physician could mend. It's a paradox that runs through the entire profession, hated for their role in death, valued for their skill in preserving life. We'll pause here, on that uneasy note, the executioner at dusk, sitting alone at his door, sharpening his blades, perhaps listening to the faint sounds of the town that does its best to pretend he isn't there. Tomorrow, perhaps he'll lance a boil or reset a bone, or maybe he'll just tend his garden and wait for the next summons from the town hall. Because that was the real life of most executioners. Not endless blood and spectacle, but long, quiet stretches of waiting for death to call again. What did executioners do when there were no executions? The most unpopular profession in town tonight. We're drifting back to a world where public execution was a perfectly normal part of civic life, where your city might have its own designated gallows, helpfully located near the market square, for convenience, and where one man, usually dressed in something ominously red or black, showed up to do the job that everyone needed, but no one wanted to talk about. Tonight's story is about him, the executioner, the man who made justice visible, and who paid dearly for the privilege. But our question isn't what you might expect. We're not asking how he executed people, or even who he killed. We're asking something stranger. What did he do when there were no executions? Because the truth is, those beheadings and hangings you see in movies, those were rare. Most towns only had a handful of capital cases a year, and yet the executioner had to live somewhere, eat something, raise children, pay rent. So tonight, we'll drift through his off-duty hours, through the quieter, more awkward side of the job, when there was nothing to chop, hang, or burn, and the man with the axe had to find something else to do. The job no one wanted. Let's start with the obvious. No one wanted to be an executioner. Tithe wasn't an occupation you trained for as a child. There was no cheerful apprenticeship, no young executioner of the year award. In most of medieval Europe, it was a hereditary curse. If your father had been an executioner, then congratulations. You probably would be too, because no one else would marry into the family, and no other trade guild would have you. You were officially part of the community, but socially exiled from it. People needed you, but pretended not to. It's a strange, psychological space to exist in. Imagine being simultaneously essential and despised. You were the keeper of civic justice and the walking embodiment of death. Even priests were hesitant to bless your meals, and yet someone had to do the job. So, when the town's appointed executioner wasn't busy, he had to get creative about how to fill his time. The town's unofficial sanitation department. One of the executioner's most common side jobs was sanitation. Because if you're already good at disposing of things, people don't want to touch corpses. Mostly, then you might as well handle all the other unpleasant tasks too. In German-speaking regions, executioners were often responsible for clearing away dead animals from the streets. Cattle that died suddenly. Stray dogs. Even horses. Sometimes, they'd skin the carcasses and sell the hides to tanners. The meat, if it wasn't too far gone, might be sold to dog breeders, or used in questionable sausages. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table, and once you got used to the smell of decay, you were already halfway to being qualified. Some executioners also maintained the town's lepers' pits, isolated burial areas for those deemed too contagious or too sinful for churchyards. If plague struck, they were the ones called to collect the bodies. No one else dared. So when death took a holiday, the executioner didn't. He simply found smaller, smellier versions of it. The butcher and the barber. When there were no heads to remove officially, some executioners turned to the next best thing, cutting animals or hair. Many became butchers, because the skills overlapped nicely. Sharp blades, steady hands, limited small talk. It was honest work. If people could get past the mental image. In some towns, though even that was considered too unsavory, so executioners became barbers. It might sound odd, but in the Middle Ages, barbers also performed minor surgery, bloodletting, tooth-pulling, even setting bones. And if there was one man who knew anatomy better than most, it was the executioner. Records from early modern France show executioners running side businesses, pulling teeth, curing minor infections, and selling homemade medicines. They weren't doctors, but they were surprisingly popular. Mostly because they charged less and didn't ask awkward questions. There's something wonderfully ironic about the idea of the town executioner doubling as its dentist. On Monday, he might remove a molar. On Tuesday, he might remove a head. Efficiency at its finest. The awkward geography of shunning now. Let's talk about where executioners lived. Because naturally, you couldn't have them living right next to the church or the bakery. That would be uncomfortable. So most towns built small houses for them just outside the city walls, near the gallows or the gibbet. Sometimes these were called executioners' towers, or hangman's cottages. They were technically respectable government housing, but in the least desirable zip code imaginable. It wasn't unusual for travelers to report that the only building on a lonely hill outside town was the executioner's home, his family garden, and perhaps a few chickens. Chickens who, one assumes, were very well behaved. Even his children inherited the stigma. They were often forbidden to attend school with other children. Marriage prospects, limited to other executioner families. or those truly desperate for a dowry. In Germany, there were entire dynasties of executioners, passing the job from father to son for centuries, because no one else would take them. Imagine being born into a trade where your family tree was basically a public health hazard. The strange privileges of the EBE profession, but it wasn't all misery. Executioners did have certain perks. They were legally protected. For one thing, harming or insulting an executioner was a punishable offense, because, technically, he was an officer of the court. They were also exempt from many taxes, an incentive, perhaps to keep them loyal, and in some towns, they received free beer from local brewers, since no one wanted to risk cursing the man responsible for your eternal fate. Executioners also had access to an unusual source of income: medical ingredients, because, you see, for much of medieval and early modern history, human body parts were believed to have healing properties. Yes, really, powdered skull was used to treat epilepsy. Dried blood, preferably from a freshly executed criminal, was thought to cure consumption, and fat rendered from human flesh was used in ointments for arthritis. The executioner was the one man legally allowed to harvest and sell these materials, a gruesome but lucrative sideline business. In Nuremberg, the town executioner kept an official price list for such items. It read a bit like a macabre farmer's market inventory. So when there were no executions, the local apothecaries might still knock politely on his door, shopping for, let's say, supplies. It's hard to imagine a more unsettling form of freelance work. The executioner as local celebrity. Despite their ostracism, executioners held a certain fascination for the public. People feared them, yes, but they also loved gossiping about them. Their skills with the sword or axe were legendary. Good executioner could take a head off, cleanly in one stroke. A bad one might need several attempts, an error that tended to linger in popular memory. Some became minor celebrities. In 17th century France, Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner of Paris, became so famous that nobles visited him at home just to hear his stories. He executed more than 3,000 people during the Revolution, including King Louis XVI himself. But in his off hours, he collected books, played the violin, and entertained guests who pretended not to be terrified of him. Earlier, in the Holy Roman Empire, there was Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, who kept a meticulous diary of every execution he performed. But what's more interesting is how he described his days between executions. He spent them tending his garden, practicing minor surgery, and playing with his children. He even treated illnesses among the poor for free. It's strangely comforting and unsettling to think of the town's executioner quietly, watering his cabbages after a day's work. The children of the axe. And speaking of children, what was it like growing up in an executioner's family? In one word, complicated. They were legally citizens, but socially invisible. Many were baptized in separate fonts, because people feared contamination. At festivals, their families were required to stand apart. But they adapted. Some children of executioners became skilled healers or midwives. Others ran taverns or butcher shops, since customers didn't mind their company if alcohol or meat was involved. And a few, remarkably, managed to escape the trade entirely. By the 18th century, some executioners' children studied medicine formally, leveraging their anatomical experience into respectable careers. Imagine explaining that at a job interview. Yes, I come from a long line of public executioners, but I assure you, I'm much more into preventative care. When there were truly no executions, now and then, entire decades would pass without a single beheading or hanging. During peaceful reigns, or in small towns with little crime, the executioner's sword might gather dust. In those times, he became a kind of civic handyman. He maintained the gallows, repaired torture instruments, and occasionally handled pest control, especially rats. There are records from 15th century Bavaria of executioners being paid to drown stray dogs, exterminate insects, or clean the sewers. Apparently, once you've seen what the human body can do, nothing else really bothers you. They were also responsible for testing new instruments of punishment. Not on people, thankfully, but on sacks of sand, straw effigies, or the occasional unlucky pig. It was quality control, in its own grim way. What did people do with dead bodies before cemeteries existed? The earliest burials, before the church got involved. Soft intro music fades in. A few slow piano notes, maybe a distant owl. You take a breath. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time before the tidy rows of tombstones, before the marble angels, before the whole rest in peace idea even existed. We're going to wander through a quieter kind of past, the long, uncomfortable centuries when humanity was still figuring out what to do with its dead. Because, contrary to what you might assume, there was not always a plan. The forgotten figures, the ones who slipped between the cracks of history. So, if you're lying down, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade into the background, and let's talk about something very old, very universal, and very awkward. What people did with dead bodies before cemeteries existed. The first problem: bodies everywhere you see. For most of human history, people have been dying inconveniently. That is to say, wherever they happen to be. In the beginning, there wasn't really a system for this. Death was local, immediate, and personal. Archaeologists love to tell us that the earliest burials go back about 100,000 years, to people like Homo naledi, or the Neanderthals, who seem to have at least some sense that the dead should not just lie around. We've found their bones tucked neatly into shallow pits, sometimes dusted with red ochre, a soft mineral pigment that looks suspiciously like dried blood. Was it ritual, sentimentality, or just the practical realization that dead friends smell bad? We can't be sure. But what we can be sure of is that humans have been trying to separate the living from the dead for as long as we've been recognizably human. Caves, pits, and other poorly thought-out ideas before cemeteries. The go-to solution was holes, just basic, shallow holes in the ground. Sometimes caves, sometimes cliffs, if you were feeling dramatic. The earliest burials we found in Europe, think 40,000 years ago, were usually single individuals, tucked into the earth in a fetal position, as though curled up for a long nap. It's oddly touching, in a prehistoric way. Occasionally, they added a few decorative touches, a shell bead, an animal tooth necklace, or a favorite tool. This might have been an early form of spiritual belief, or, again, just humans being sentimental about stuff. But for the most part, there wasn't yet a grand philosophy of death, just the practical task of putting it somewhere else. And that's really the beginning of burial culture. The endless, creative attempts to make corpses someone else's problem. When graves became statements fast forward a bit, say, to the Neolithic period, humans are building houses, planting crops, and realizing that burying grandma right next to the door is not ideal for morale. This is when we start seeing communal burial mounds, the first group projects in mortuary architecture, large earthen barrows, filled with the remains of entire families or villages. They weren't exactly cemeteries yet, but they were something close, shared resting places for a whole community, visible on the landscape. In Northern Europe, they took this very seriously. Some of these mounds were enormous, built and rebuilt over generations, layer upon layer of ancestors packed inside like a geological record of grief. People would open them periodically, rearrange bones, add new ones, and sometimes take souvenirs. Yes, actual bones. Human femurs used as ancestral relics, jawbones as lucky charms, skulls placed in hearths for spiritual protection. Essentially, your great-great-grandmother could become part of your home decor. The inconvenience of too many dead people. You can imagine the problem. The more successful a settlement became, the more people it had to bury, and ancient people like us had trouble throwing things away, including bodies. By around 3000 BCE, we start seeing a shift toward more organized burial grounds, places slightly outside of town, where the deceased could decompose in peace, preferably downwind. But this was still a long way from what we'd call a cemetery. There were no individual graves with little markers, no neat rows, no fences. Most burials were communal, anonymous, and very, very smelly. Graveyards were often shared with livestock. The lines between place for the dead and field for the living were still blurry at best. And because decomposition was not exactly quick or consistent, these spaces had a way of reintroducing themselves. Heavy rains could wash bones to the surface. Scavenging animals might scatter remains. And if you needed to reuse a pit, well, you just dug a little deeper and made room. The dead, at this stage of human history, were more like long-term guests than permanent residents. The ancient Egyptians. Death as a career path, but while most cultures were winging it, Egypt was thriving in the business of dying. The ancient Egyptians built an entire economy around making death glamorous, or at least orderly. Their deserts were perfect natural preservatives, and they quickly realized that sand-dried corpses didn't rot, so they leaned into it. Hard burial became a performance of social status. The poor might get a simple sand grave. The middle class could afford a mud brick coffin, and the elite, they got mummified, which, contrary to what movies suggest, was less mystical ritual and more very slow. Very expensive artisanal dehydration, organs removed, bodies stuffed with salt, wrapped, labeled, decorated, and finally placed in a tomb stocked with everything you'd need for eternity. Food, clothes, furniture, and, in some unfortunate cases, servants. Egyptians weren't the first to care about the afterlife, but they were the first to make it a full-time job. Entire professions revolved around preparing, transporting, and entombing the dead. You could make a decent living from the endless human desire not to rot unceremoniously. The Greeks and their "please stop haunting me" philosophy The Greeks, as usual, had opinions about everything, including how to handle corpses. They believed that improper burial left a person's soul wandering, restless, and mildly inconvenient for everyone involved, so they took great care to ensure that even enemies got a decent burial, ideally with a coin in the mouth to pay the ferryman on their trip to the underworld. They cremated their dead, scattered the ashes, and held elaborate feasts in their honor. Not because they were sentimental, but because they didn't want ghosts hanging around. You might say that early. Greek funerary culture was less about honoring the dead, and more about managing the supernatural equivalent of bad Yelp reviews. The Romans. Organized, bureaucratic, and occasionally gross. Then came the Romans, a people who brought structure, paperwork, and a mild obsession with hygiene to almost everything, including death. Roman law prohibited burials within city limits, a sensible decision, given the smell and the rats, so they created long rows of tombs along roads outside the cities, each elaborately inscribed with the names and deeds of the deceased. The wealthy built massive family mausoleums, while the poor relied on columbaria, underground chambers filled with little niches for urns. Think of it as ancient storage units for ashes, except with better architecture. And, naturally, being Romans, they had death clubs, literal membership societies that ensured you'd get a proper burial, even if you died broke. You paid your dues while alive, and the club covered your funeral when you inevitably didn't show up to the next meeting. Efficient, if morbid. The problem of the forgotten. Poor for all this sophistication, one thing remained constant. The rich got buried beautifully, and the poor didn't across ancient civilizations. The less fortunate were often dumped in mass graves, thrown into rivers, or left to decay in open air. It wasn't callousness, exactly. Just practicality. Caring for the dead required space, time, and money, all luxuries that peasants didn't have. So for much of human history, the majority of people died unceremoniously and disappeared into the soil, unrecorded and unnamed. It's humbling, in a way. Most of the ancient dead are lost, not because of war or plague, but because nobody thought they were important enough to preserve. Let's drift now, from these dry plains and dusty tombs to something darker, and a bit closer to home. Because once Christianity arrived in Europe, things got complicated. Suddenly, burial wasn't just a practical matter anymore. It became a spiritual one, and that, as we'll see in the next part, created a whole new set of problems, and some very smelly churchyards. Let's drift a little, now, to the idea of bad smells as punishment, because medieval people didn't just endure foul odors, they weaponized them. Cities dumped refuse outside the homes of criminals. Corrupt officials might have carrion placed near their door. The message was clear: your soul stinks. In religious plays, demons were always accompanied by sulfur and rot, while angels smelled of incense. Smell was moral theater, a way to visualize sin through the nose. And if you think that's weird, remember that we still describe people as fishy when they're suspicious. Some habits die hard. All of this means that when we ask, how did they smell? And we're really asking a deeper question. What did it mean to smell? To medieval people, odor wasn't just a byproduct of biology. It was a sign of who you were, your class, your health, even your soul. You couldn't escape it, and you didn't really try. You just managed it, like the weather. And that, in its own way, is almost peaceful. The Gilded Cage tonight. We're drifting back to a time when being a royal child wasn't necessarily a blessing. When peace treaties came with a catch, and when you might spend your adolescence in a foreign castle, surrounded by smiling guards and beautifully locked doors. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Let the mind soften a little. Because tonight, we're asking, what did royal hostages do all day? The phrase royal hostage sounds dramatic. It conjures up dungeons, chains, desperate escape attempts. But in most of history, it was nothing like that. Royal hostages were rarely tortured or starved. They were usually treated well, dressed in silk, fed properly, educated. Their purpose wasn't to suffer. It was to behave. They were living insurance policies, a reminder to their fathers and brothers that peace treaties were meant to be honored. It was, essentially, the medieval version of clicking, "I agree to the terms and conditions." Only the terms were your children, and the conditions were war. Let's start somewhere familiar. Medieval Europe. The age of kings, castles, and politely concealed threats. When two rival monarchs finally agreed to stop killing each other, one of them would often hand over a son, or sometimes a daughter, as a pledge of good faith. The child would be taken to the other court and raised there, usually in comfort, under the watchful eye of their captors. If the treaty held, all was well. If it didn't, well, there were always dungeons. One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from the Viking Age. In the 10th century, a young prince named Harold, son of the Norwegian king, was sent to the court of King Ethelstan of England as a hostage. He wasn't thrown into a cell. He was raised among English nobles, taught the language, dined at the king's table. In time, he became so fond of English customs that when he eventually went home, he introduced them in Norway, much to everyone's confusion. It's one of those moments where diplomacy accidentally turns into cultural exchange, or, depending on your view, mild indoctrination. But not all hostages adapted so smoothly. Some found the Gilded Cage unbearable. Consider John II of France, the unfortunate king captured by the English during the 100 Years' War. In 1360, he signed the Treaty of Bretigny, promising to pay an enormous ransom for his freedom. To guarantee payment, he sent several noblemen and his own son as hostages to England. The hostages lived well. They played tournaments, wore velvet, attended feasts. But after years of waiting for France to pay up, one of John's sons escaped. John was mortified. So mortified, in fact, that he voluntarily returned to English captivity. He said a king's word must be his bond, which is noble, in a way, though he promptly died in London a few months later. Moral integrity? Yes. Excellent judgment? No. Being a royal hostage wasn't always as tragic as it sounds. Sometimes it was an education in power. Let's drift to the Ottoman Empire, where hostage-taking became an art form. From the 14th century onward, the Ottomans used a system called devshirme, the collection. They would take Christian boys from conquered territories and train them as soldiers or administrators. Many of them became elite guards, the famous janissaries. But among these, there were also genuine royal hostages, sons of regional rulers, brought to Istanbul to be raised in the Ottoman court. It was a clever move. Educate your enemies' children in your language, your customs, your religion, and by the time they inherit their father's lands, they're half Ottoman anyway. It's difficult to rebel against the empire when you've spent your youth learning how its dinner parties work. A similar idea existed in medieval England, where noble children were fostered at other noble households. In theory, this was for education. In practice, it was also a way of making sure no one got too ambitious. If your son was living at court, you were much less likely to plot against the king. It's hard to rebel when your family reunion is technically government property. And so, young aristocrats spent their days learning courtesy, falconry, poetry, and, inevitably, how to survive in an environment where every smile was a form of surveillance. But let's slow down and think about what that actually felt like. Imagine being 12 years old. You've been taken from your home, your language, your friends. You're dressed beautifully, but constantly reminded that you're not free. Your tutors are polite, your captors are cordial, and everyone assures you that you're part of the family. You eat with the people who conquered your father. You sleep in rooms lined with gold you're not allowed to touch. And every morning, you wake up knowing that your existence is someone else's guarantee of peace. It's not violence. It's quiet, exquisite control. One of the most striking cases comes from 16th century Scotland. In 1526, the young James V was taken hostage, not by a foreign power, but by his own noblemen. He was a boy king surrounded by adults who considered themselves better at ruling. They protected him, of course, fed him well, dressed him properly, even allowed him to ride and hunt. But they also made sure every decision he made had to be approved by them first. It's one of those classic royal paradoxes. Technically free, practically imprisoned, James eventually escaped, took revenge, and became a deeply suspicious adult. Understandably. Let's drift south for a moment, to Spain, and one of the most peculiar hostage stories in royal history. In the early 16th century, King Francis III of France lost a disastrous battle to Emperor Charles V and was captured. He was treated well, kept in comfort, with books, servants, and meals better than most nobles could dream of. But to secure his release, he agreed to hand over his two young sons as hostages. They were 11 and 7 years old. The boys were taken to Spain and lived under polite confinement for 4 years. They had tutors, doctors, and wardrobes of fine silk. They were even allowed to play outside. But they were still prisoners. Watched, measured, reported on. One of them, the future Henry II, never forgot it. When he finally returned to France, he refused to speak Spanish ever again and hated Charles V with a quiet, lifelong bitterness. It's a perfect example of how hostage diplomacy created not just treaties, but generational grudges. Of course, not all royal hostages were children. Some were adults who simply had the misfortune of losing wars. Take Mary, Queen of Scots. She spent 19 years as a guest of her cousin Elizabeth I. Technically, she was treated with respect. She lived in castles, had servants, embroidered, received visitors, but she wasn't allowed to leave. For nearly 2 decades, she woke up each morning surrounded by guards pretending not to be guards. Her letters were intercepted. Her visitors were vetted. Her food was tasted. She passed the time sewing elaborate tapestries and plotting escape attempts that never quite worked. When she was finally executed, Elizabeth claimed to be shocked, though one suspects she wasn't that shocked. If you notice a theme forming, it's that royal hostage ships were rarely about cruelty. They were about optics. It was a way to show mercy while keeping control. You could lock your enemy's heir in a dungeon. But that made you look barbaric. Better to raise them in luxury, feed them well, educate them, and remind them, subtly, constantly, that their comfort depended on your goodwill. It was diplomacy disguised as generosity. Still, some hostages adapted almost too well. Consider Theodoric the Great, an Ostrogothic prince in the late Roman Empire. As a boy, he was sent to Constantinople as a hostage, essentially a barbarian exchange student. There, he learned Greek, Roman manners, and imperial politics. When he returned home, he used those lessons to conquer Italy. He kept the Roman Senate, preserved Roman law, and ruled in Roman style. In short, the hostage became the empire's best imitator. It's one of history's great ironies. A man educated by his captors ended up recreating their civilization better than they could. The daily life of a royal hostage depended on who was holding you. In a well-run court, you might attend lessons, go hunting, practice swordplay, or play music. In a more paranoid court, you might spend your days under surveillance, carefully pretending to enjoy embroidery while wondering if the wine was safe. Letters from captive nobles often describe a kind of listless routine. They complain of boredom, not brutality, the endless repetition of polite meals, formal greetings, enforced gratitude. Time itself became a form of confinement. Days stretched, unchanging, in corridors that smelled faintly of wax and dust. And yet, there were moments of tenderness. Prince and captives sometimes became genuine friends. Royal. Children raised together could develop lifelong bonds, or rivalries. Many hostages ended up marrying into their captors' families, merging bloodlines that had once been at war. It's strange, but perhaps inevitable. If you spend long enough in your enemy's palace, the walls begin to feel like home. So what did royal hostages do all day? They waited. They learned. They played polite games, read devotional texts, and rehearsed the art of endurance. Their captivity was woven into ceremony, an elegant facade over something quietly desperate. And when the world finally changed, when treaties were signed or wars resumed, they either went home to rule or disappeared quietly into history. Because as the centuries went on, royal hostages weren't just leverage anymore. They became symbols, exotic, tragic, and sometimes unintentionally famous. And that is where our next chapter begins. The scent of the Middle Ages tonight. We're drifting back to a world that didn't smell quite the way you're imagining. Go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Take a slow breath, and let's travel together to an age before toothpaste, before deodorant, before soap as we know it, when the line between perfume and poison was, frankly, negotiable. Because tonight, we're asking a question most historians don't want to think about too closely. How did medieval people actually smell? Now, popular imagination paints the Middle Ages as one long, unwashed nightmare. Everyone reeking of sweat, rot, and damp wool. Hollywood loves that image. It's dramatic. It's gritty. It's also, inconveniently, not completely true. Medieval. People did smell different from us. There's no avoiding that. But they weren't the walking compost heaps we like to picture. They just lived in a world where scent meant something different. It wasn't a sign of moral failure or laziness. It was simply part of being alive. To start, we need to understand that in the medieval mind, smell was a form of morality. The way a thing smelled was thought to reveal its spiritual quality. Heaven smelled like roses. Hell, unsurprisingly, smelled like sulfur. If your house stank, it might not just be dirty, it might be sinful. So people took scent very seriously. Not necessarily in a hygienic sense, but in a metaphysical one. And the air itself didn't help. Cities like London or Paris were built around open sewers, rotting fish markets, and large populations of people who kept livestock indoors, sometimes in the same room where they slept. You can picture it. Smoky hearths, tallow candles, damp thatch, mud floors, and somewhere nearby a pig or two. It wasn't dirty, per se. It was normal. In that kind of world, everyone smelled like something, usually smoke, sweat, and whatever they'd eaten for dinner. And because everyone was used to it, it wasn't considered unpleasant, it was just background noise. Bathing, however, is where the story gets complicated. Medieval people did wash, just not quite the way we do. They washed their hands and faces regularly, sometimes even multiple times a day. They cleaned their teeth with linen cloths and herbal pastes. They changed their linen shirts often, because linen absorbed sweat and oil, and a fresh shirt was thought to purify the body. What they didn't always do was full-body bathing in water, and that wasn't because they didn't know how. It was because they thought it could kill you. You see, medieval medicine revolved around something called the humoral theory, the belief that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each fluid was linked to an element, a temperament, and even a season. It was a beautiful, nonsensical system that allowed doctors to explain everything without curing anything. According to this worldview, bathing opened the pores too much. When your pores were open, bad air, known as miasma, could seep into your body and cause disease. So, yes, they avoided too much washing. To stay healthy. It made perfect sense at the time. But don't picture them as grimy hermits afraid of water. They loved baths, philosophically, if not always practically. Public bathhouses existed in medieval towns from Paris to Prague. They were social hubs, somewhere between a spa, a tavern, and a low-key dating service. People went to gossip, relax, eat, drink, and, occasionally, commit light adultery. Church officials complained about it constantly, which is how we know it was popular. Baths were scented with herbs like rosemary, thyme, and marjoram. Water was sometimes infused with rose petals or chamomile. It wasn't exactly sterile, but it was pleasant. The real problem came later, in the 14th and 15th centuries, when the plague started turning up uninvited. when the Black Death struck, physicians blamed, of course, bad air. They decided that bathing made the body more vulnerable, because it opened those pesky pores again. Naturally, the solution was to stop bathing altogether, and they did. For centuries. The bathhouses closed, perfume use skyrocketed, and the age of scented filth began. Let's drift into that a bit. If you couldn't safely wash your body, you covered its smell instead. Noble women soaked their gloves in rosewater. Men wore little pouches of herbs called pomanders around their necks. Perfume became a health measure. Because a pleasant smell, they believed, protected you from disease. Doctors carried posies of flowers in front of their faces, thinking it would filter the air. It didn't, of course, but it did make dying slightly more fragrant. The wealthy took things further. They didn't just perfume their bodies, they perfumed their clothes, their sheets, even their pets. There are recipes for perfumed horse saddles, because if your horse smelled good, surely God would be impressed. The poor, meanwhile, had fewer options. Their homes smelled of wood smoke, onions, sweat, and whatever animal parts they'd been boiling for dinner. But again, this wasn't scandalous. It was ordinary. A well-seasoned human smell, as it were. One thing that did make a difference, though, was linen. Medieval people loved linen. It was smooth, breathable, and, most importantly, washable. Wool garments might go months without a scrub, but linen could be rinsed and bleached in the sun. So even if someone hadn't taken a bath in weeks, their undergarments might still be relatively clean. And because linen touched the skin, it absorbed sweat and oils, meaning the outer layers stayed fresher. If you ever wondered how someone like Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine could survive a summer in armor and fur, the answer is probably an unreasonable number of linen chemises. Speaking of queens, let's talk about what clean meant to them. Medieval royalty lived in luxurious filth. They had servants whose entire job was to carry portable toilets, known as garderobes, from room to room. Their castles smelled perpetually of damp stone, tallow, and human waste. But that didn't mean they didn't try to be refined. They used scented soaps made from olive oil, pine resin, and herbs. They washed their hands before and after every meal, in basins filled with rosewater. They sprinkled herbs on the floor to mask the smell of unventilated rooms. In England, Henry III ordered his palace floors strewn with rushes and lavender, which sounds charming until you realize the rushes trapped crumbs, fleas, and various liquids of mysterious origin. So, yes, his palace smelled like lavender and something else. Medieval people also believed that smell could affect character. A saint, for instance, was supposed to smell faintly of lilies. A sinner, naturally, of sulfur. If someone's corpse emitted a pleasant scent after death, that was considered proof of holiness and the odor of sanctity. There are medieval accounts of bodies, exhumed years later, that supposedly smelled like flowers. One can assume this was optimistic reporting, but still, the belief mattered. It meant that scent was tied to salvation itself. Let's pause here for a moment and imagine walking through a 13th century street. You'd smell the tanners, pits first, pungent mixtures of urine, lime, and animal hides. Then the bakers' ovens. wood smoke, and fresh bread, mingled with the sharper scent of beer brewing in the next alley. There would be horses, people, rotting vegetables, spilled ale, maybe incense drifting from a nearby church. It would be a lot, but to them it was home, and, to be fair, they probably thought we smelled strange. Chemical detergents, plastic, deodorant, artificial citrus. Every age has its own version of normal. We also need to remember that most medieval people lived outdoors far more than we do. Their bodies were acclimated to natural odors: smoke, rain, sweat, dirt. It wasn't as offensive to them as it is to our indoor noses. And, when the weather turned, they didn't rush to scrub everything down. They simply layered on more wool, and maybe hung a bag of herbs around their neck for good measure. Cleanliness, in their eyes, was spiritual and social, not bacterial. If your soul was pure and your linen white, that was good enough. But still, some people genuinely enjoyed bathing, and some went to extravagant lengths to do so. Charlemagne, for instance, loved hot baths. He had a pool built at Aachen large enough to fit 100 people, and invited friends and courtiers to join him. They sat in the water discussing politics and poetry, which sounds more civilized than it probably was. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward the First, kept a traveling bath tent that followed her on campaigns, because even when invading Wales, one must prioritize exfoliation. So, while the church frowned upon excess bathing, certain royals quietly ignored that advice, especially when they could afford to heat water, which most people couldn't. Monasteries were a different story. Monks were obsessed with cleanliness, but only in a practical, regulated sense. They bathed once or twice a year, whether they needed it or not, and shaved their heads weekly. Their clothes were washed at prescribed intervals, usually depending on the saint's calendar. Nuns, on the other hand, were known for their herbal waters, simple infusions of rosemary or mint used to wipe the face and hands. It was part hygiene, part devotion, and probably part damage control in enclosed convents with poor ventilation. Now, here's where it gets more personal, because no matter the class or location, everyone in medieval Europe shared one problem. Body odor was communal. They lived in close quarters, slept several to a bed, shared towels, tools, and sometimes, alarmingly, undergarments. Your smell blended with everyone else's. Privacy as a concept barely existed. The empire ends, but the eunuchs remain tonight. We're drifting back to a world of silks, incense, and whispering corridors. A world of palaces with too many doors, and too few people allowed to open them. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Loosen your jaw a little. Unclench that thing you've been unconsciously clenching all day. Because tonight, we're exploring one of history's strangest fates. What did happen to the eunuchs after the empire fell? Now, eunuchs are one of those historical realities we tend to forget, like chamber pots or medieval dentistry. They were everywhere, and yet we politely pretend they weren't. For nearly 2,000 years, empires from China to Byzantium to the Ottoman court relied on them. Men without heirs, desires, or personal agendas. At least, that was the idea. They were supposed to be the perfect servants. But of course, they weren't. Let's start with the Byzantine Empire. A civilization that somehow lasted for over 1,000 years, despite being perpetually broke, perpetually at war, and perpetually convinced that God cared deeply about their internal palace gossip. In Constantinople, eunuchs were everywhere. They guarded the imperial chambers, ran the treasury, sang in the choirs, and occasionally, awkwardly, led armies. The Byzantines, as usual, had rules. Only eunuchs could touch the empresses. Carriage. Only eunuchs could serve in certain offices near the royal bedchamber. And yes, only eunuchs could rise high enough to influence the emperor's private life without raising any eyebrows, which meant that by the 10th century, the empire's most powerful men were, technically, not men at all. Now, becoming a eunuch wasn't exactly a childhood dream. It was more of an occupational hazard, one you didn't choose, and one you couldn't really explain at parties. Some were enslaved as boys. Others, believe it or not, were volunteers, usually ambitious families who decided that losing one son's prospects in marriage was worth gaining access to the imperial court. In a sense, it was an early form of career networking, just with sharper consequences. The operation was done early, of course, and the survival rate wasn't great. The Byzantines, to their credit, had medical texts detailing how to keep the child alive afterward, which is touching in the bleakest possible way. And so, an empire's inner machinery was staffed by men who would never have children, never marry, and, technically, never fully belong to any family again. It sounds tragic, and often it was, but it also meant they could devote themselves entirely to service. They were incorruptible, supposedly detached, which made it all the more ironic when some of them became the most corrupt and ambitious figures in the empire. Take Basil Lecapenus. He was the son of an emperor, Romanos Farfurn, but because he was born illegitimate, he was castrated as a child. This was meant to prevent him from ever claiming the throne. Instead, he simply decided to run it from behind the scenes. By the 970s, Basil controlled the empire's finances, its foreign policy, and, quite possibly, the emperor himself. He accepted bribes, exiled rivals, and amassed so much wealth that his house was said to glitter with gold leaf mosaics. Eventually, he was overthrown for treason, because of course he was. Still, for several decades, a eunuch was effectively the most powerful man in Byzantium. So when the empire began to fall, slowly, tragically, like a very long candle running out of wax, its eunuchs fell with it, but not all at once. When Constantinople finally collapsed in 1453, under the cannons of the Ottoman Turks, the last Byzantine officials included several eunuchs. Some were executed, others quietly absorbed into the Ottoman bureaucracy, because, interestingly enough, the new empire also had plenty of eunuchs. If anything, the Ottomans perfected the system. Let's drift eastward now. The Ottoman Empire in its prime was a strange, glittering machine built on human hierarchy. At the top sat the Sultan. Below him, a small mountain of servants, slaves, guards, viziers, concubines, and, of course, eunuchs. They came in two main varieties. There were the white eunuchs, usually from the Balkans or the Caucasus, who handled administration, paperwork, and diplomacy, and the black eunuchs, mostly from East Africa, who ran the harem and oversaw palace life. The most powerful of all was the chief black eunuch, the Kızlar Ağa. Now, the Kızlar Ağa was technically a servant, but in practice, Frederiksted, Siritid and Tuans, he was one of the most influential men in the empire. He controlled access to the Sultan's family. including the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who was often the real power behind the throne. Together, they formed a quiet alliance of people who, by design, weren't supposed to rule anything. The chief eunuch handled palace finances, influenced appointments, and even mediated between the Sultan and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He could order executions, exile viziers, and sometimes decide who would live to see the next dawn. For someone officially classed as property, that's not bad. But like the Byzantines before them, the Ottomans eventually began to crumble. And when the empire finally dissolved in the early 20th century, its eunuchs were suddenly, well, unemployed. Imagine dedicating your entire existence to serving an emperor, and then waking up one morning to find out that emperors no longer exist. No one had prepared them for a republic. Some were quietly pensioned off, allowed to live out their days in former palace quarters. Others stayed in Istanbul, serving wealthy families as caretakers, tutors, or rather touchingly, storytellers. There's a photograph from around 1912 of the last surviving harem eunuchs posing together, dignified, weary, wrapped in heavy robes. Their eyes look somewhere between pride and confusion, because for them, history had ended, and they were still there. But let's not drift too far ahead. We should pause here and take in how deep the institution ran, because the eunuch wasn't just a palace employee, he was a cultural archetype. Every empire had its own version. Every emperor had his own trusted eunuch, and almost every one of those empires eventually fell, while the eunuchs, against all odds, survived long enough to see it happen. In China, the system lasted the longest, and grew the strangest. Chinese eunuchs served emperors for over 2,000 years. They were meant to be loyal, obedient, and incapable of forming dynasties. Naturally, they formed factions, conspiracies, and private militias instead. At times, the Forbidden City was practically run by eunuchs. They controlled the emperor's schedule, censored documents, spied on officials, and, occasionally, executed their rivals. Some became fabulously rich. Others died in dungeons. And through it all, they maintained an unspoken rule. No matter what happened, the Son of Heaven must never know that he wasn't in charge. One of the most notorious was Wei Zhongxian. In the early 1600s, he began life as a gambler, castrated himself after a losing streak, and somehow ended up controlling the Ming dynasty. He built temples to himself, executed thousands, and had poets forced to praise his virtue. Eventually, when the emperor died, the new regime ordered his suicide. Wei complied, politely, efficiently, and left behind a mansion filled with gold. Because even eunuchs, apparently, could live the full tyrant experience. By the late 19th century, though, the system was collapsing. The last generation of Chinese eunuchs found themselves trapped in a changing world. Their emperors were children. Their palaces were museums, and their lifelong vows of loyalty were suddenly obsolete. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1911, the eunuchs who had once guarded the dragon throne were told, rather abruptly, that their services were no longer needed. Some drifted into poverty. Others became tour guides at the Forbidden City, leading foreign visitors through rooms they had once cleaned, guarded, and prayed in. It's hard to imagine a more surreal retirement plan. One of them, Sun Yaoting, lived until 1996. He had been castrated as a child to serve the last emperor, Puyi, but by the time he reached the palace, the monarchy was already gone. He lived long enough to see himself become a living relic. He gave interviews, smiled for cameras, and described in detail the quiet emptiness of life after the throne. It's oddly poetic. A man altered forever to serve an emperor, who turned out not to exist. Every empire that used eunuchs told itself the same story, that these men would be loyal, selfless, safe, that they could be trusted precisely because they had nothing to lose. And in every empire, the story ended the same way. The eunuchs outlived the emperors, outlasted the dynasties, and watched as everything they had served simply vanished. But before we move too far into melancholy, let's not forget the irony of it all. Eunuchs were supposed to symbolize control of the body, of desire, of politics. Yet they often represented the exact opposite. They were living proof that power finds a way, even when you remove every possible reason to seek it. And when the empires fell, Byzantine, Ottoman, Ming, Qing, they were the only ones left to remember how it all used to be. So it wasn't so much that no one smelled bad. It's that everyone smelled equally human, and in a strange way that made the world more intimate. So let's drift now to the quieter stories, those who weren't grand viziers or imperial treasurers, but the nameless attendants who carried keys, polished floors, and woke emperors at dawn. Because for every famous eunuch who schemed his way into legend, there were hundreds who simply did their jobs, and when the empire ended, they just kept doing them. The spare, the forgotten, and the mildly inconvenient tonight. We're drifting back through the quieter corners of royal history, the places where the forgotten children lived, the ones who were born into palaces, but not into purpose. You know, the royal spares, those unlucky younger sons and daughters who arrived to great fanfare, and then spent the rest of their lives in a kind of polite irrelevance, because in most monarchies, only one child truly mattered, the heir. The rest were, well, decorative, useful for alliances, perhaps occasionally tragic, sometimes scandalous, but very rarely happy. So tonight, we're going to sink into the soft candlelight of palaces past and explore what actually happened to all those other royal children. The spares, the extras, the in case of emergency, break glass, variety of nobility. You might want to get comfortable. This story takes its time. The problem of being born. Second in theory. Being born into royalty sounds ideal. Velvet cradle, endless servants, tiny golden spoons. In reality, it depended entirely on your birth order. If you were the firstborn, congratulations, you were the future. Your education, your clothing, even your food were carefully monitored. You had tutors, advisors, and at least one courtier whose sole job was to flatter you. But if you were second, well, then you were a spare. Your purpose was to exist just in case your older sibling died, which, in fairness, happened a lot. Medieval childhood was roughly as safe as juggling knives during an earthquake. So, yes, the second-born mattered, but only provisionally, and once the heir survived into adulthood, you became a bit of a problem, too royal to ignore, too unimportant to matter. Spare sons. Professional disappointments. Let's start with the sons, because spare princes were often raised with just enough power to be dangerous. Take Prince John of Gaunt, the third surviving son of King Edward III of England. Not heir, not second in line, but still, he had ambition. Naturally, he spent most of his career trying to influence, undermine or outright control his nephew, King Richard II. It did not go well, but at least he didn't rebel outright, which puts him in the top 10% of medieval uncles. Other spare sons were less subtle. In France, it was practically a sport for younger brothers to revolt against their reigning siblings. King Louis, famously referred to his younger brother Charles as the Little Fool of Berry, which is how you know family dinners were cheerful. Charles, for his part, kept conspiring against Louis, only to die young from an illness described vaguely as a chill. Suspicious? Perhaps. But in France, that counted as dying peacefully. Being a younger royal son often meant walking a fine line between loyalty and frustration. You could be rewarded with a duchy or a castle, but never too much power, because your existence alone was already a potential threat. It's hard to imagine a more confusing career path. Raised like a king, treated like a liability. The unofficial career options for spare princes. So what did they do? If you couldn't inherit, you needed a respectable backup plan. There were really only 3. Join Fitzisneen, the church. This was the royal equivalent of sending your spare son to boarding school and hoping for the best. Countless younger princes became bishops or abbots, some willingly, others under extreme parental persuasion. The medieval church was full of men who clearly would have preferred a good war to a good. Sermon 2. Marry strategically. You could be shipped off to marry a foreign princess and start a minor cadet branch of the dynasty. Think of it as the medieval version of being transferred to a smaller regional office. You still got to wear fancy robes, but no one asked your opinion anymore. Become a military ornament. Spare princes were often sent to command armies, not because they were qualified, but because it was better to risk them than the heir. Some actually turned out competent. Most did not. A perfect example is Prince Rupert of the Rhine, nephew of King Charles I of England, brilliant horseman, terrible politician. He spent the English Civil War fighting bravely and losing beautifully. When the monarchy fell, he wandered Europe as a kind of royal freelancer, dabbling in piracy, invention, and apparently glass-making. Because when you're a spare prince with no throne, there's really no wrong hobby. The daughters, political pawns in Silk Now. Royal daughters had an even narrower fate. Their value was almost entirely transactional. They were human alliances, wrapped in velvet and diplomacy. From the Middle Ages through the 18th century, royal families used daughters like chess pieces, marrying them off to seal treaties, strengthen alliances, or calm down aggressive neighbors. Take Margaret of Austria, for instance. She was engaged 3 separate times by the age of 10, widowed twice before 24, and eventually became one of Europe's most skilled political administrators, largely because she'd learned to survive royal men, or Princess Henrietta Anne of England, the youngest daughter of Charles. She was married off to the brother of Louis. 14 tarts. Femme, an arrangement that sounded glamorous, but mostly involved court gossip and passive-aggressive duels. She died mysteriously at 26 after complaining of stomach pains, the official cause, colic, the unofficial cause, possibly poison, though in fairness, France in the 1600s was about 70% poison by volume. For many royal daughters, marriage was less about romance and more about strategic exportation. You were born in one kingdom, shipped to another, and expected to smile through it. It was diplomacy with lace. Forgotten princesses. The ones who stayed home. But not all royal daughters were married off. Sometimes there were simply too many of them. In that case, you might be sent to a convent or left to live quietly at court as a kind of ornamental relative, dressed beautifully, spoken to rarely, remembered vaguely. In late medieval and early modern courts, unmarried princesses were treated with affectionate exasperation. They were the glittering wallpaper of royal life, expensive to maintain, functionally useless, but too prestigious to remove. Some took up religious devotion. Others wrote poetry. A few became unofficial advisors, often to their mothers, who understood the art of quiet survival better than anyone. But for every famous queen like Elizabeth I, who defied expectations, there were dozens of nameless sisters who never ruled, never married, and never quite mattered. Their portraits hang in galleries today, all pearls and melancholy. And if you look closely, they seem to be saying, I was born royal, but I never got to be anything else. The emotional economy of being irrelevant, it's easy to assume these forgotten royals lived in luxury. And, technically, yes, they did. They had clothes, jewels, servants, feasts, but they also had no autonomy. Every friendship, every letter, every movement was watched. They were assets, not people. Many younger royals became deeply religious, not necessarily from faith, but from boredom. Others fell into scandal just to feel alive. Prince George of Hanover, for example, spent most of his life gambling, drinking, and writing long letters about how much he hated his family. It was basically the 18th century version of a sad blog. The spare who accidentally became king, of course. Sometimes the spare's patience paid off. Heirs could die suddenly. Wars, accidents, outbreaks of something unpleasant and medieval, and when that happened, the spare was suddenly promoted. One of the most famous examples is Henry VIII. He wasn't supposed to be king at all. His older brother, Arthur, was the golden boy, the original heir, the family's entire investment. Then Arthur died of something mysterious and Tudor-sounding, and Henry was thrust into the role. We all know how that turned out. 6 wives, 2 executed queens, and a national reformation later. Henry proved that sometimes being the spare was not just unfortunate, it was dangerous for everyone else. But Henry's story reveals the quiet psychological toll of being second best. He grew up in the shadow of his dead brother, obsessed with producing heirs of his own, terrified of repeating his family's instability. It's as though he spent his entire reign trying to prove he was supposed to be there. And in a way, maybe that's what all royal spares wanted, a sense of purpose in a world that only valued the firstborn. the modernization of the spare problem as monarchies evolved. So did the role of the spare. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the old dangers, civil war, open rebellion, fraternal assassinations, were replaced by subtler miseries, boredom, scandal, and existential dread. In 19th century Europe, every royal family had a few of these decorative spare relatives. They turned up at weddings, opened hospitals, wrote questionable poetry. Some dabbled in science, others in spiritualism. A few became quite beloved precisely because they weren't expected to rule. Think of Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second son. He joined the Navy, traveled extensively, and ended up Duke of Edinburgh. Not bad, as royal side careers go, but even he wrote gloomily about feeling unnecessary. His letters are full of lines like, "There are too many of us, and not enough thrones." That's probably the most relatable thing a Victorian prince ever said. So far, we've wandered through the general problem of royal spares, the unloved middle children of monarchy. In the next stretch, we'll drift a little deeper into the personal tragedies that shaped them. The children who were imprisoned for being born inconveniently. The daughters whose bloodline made them valuable, and therefore miserable, and the spare sons who accidentally changed history while trying to avoid it.